Have you ever found yourself questioning why you're here, what your life purpose might be, or why you should even care about anything at all when everything eventually comes to an end? These questions, haunting in their directness, once plagued one of the greatest writers in history, Leo Tolstoy. It can be quite surprising to learn that someone who had achieved almost everything worldly, fame, wealth, a large estate, beloved novels, a beautiful family, could be tormented by existential dread. Yet around the age of 50, Tolstoy found himself overwhelmed by thoughts of meaninglessness, effectively challenging the notion that external success alone can secure lasting fulfillment or peace of mind. Although he was once revered for his passion for life and his literary genius, the man behind War and Peace and Anna Karenina faced moments of deep despair in which he questioned the purpose of his existence. Why did this happen to him? And more importantly, how did he find his way out of the darkness? Although we might admire Tolstoy from the safe distance of history, seeing him as a prodigious author born into aristocracy, who owned a massive farm, wrote timeless classics, and married a loving wife, the veneer of success did not protect him from life's biggest questions. Indeed, he initially lived with a kind of carefree exuberance, embracing pleasure, travel, the company of friends, and the joys of life without appearing to dwell excessively on metaphysical questions. But everything changed for him around his 50th year. A deep existential crisis set in, rocking the foundations of his previously contented life. He began to ask why. Why was he alive? Why did anything matter if, in the end, he and everyone he loved would perish? Perhaps this resonates with you or someone you know, as the why questions can strike anyone who starts to feel the weight of life's impermanence. For Tolstoy, these ruminations weren't fleeting musings, but rather a crushing despair that made it difficult for him to function. He likened himself to an emotional toddler, repeatedly asking the universe why. He even admitted that he had to trick himself to keep from taking his own life. He found brief escape in sleep, because slumber blocked out the ceaseless torment of these existential interrogations. Such a radical transformation in perspective, this shift from joyous living to nihilistic dread, can sometimes seem inexplicable, but in Tolstoy's case, many factors played a role. From a young age, he had harbored skepticism toward Christianity and the organized church. Losing both parents early on had left him feeling abandoned and disillusioned. It was perhaps inevitable that these undercurrents would eventually surface in a dramatic way. Throughout his youth and early adulthood, Tolstoy was not one to brood constantly over the fate of his soul or the meaning of life. He pursued his writing, he traveled, he mingled with influential people, and eventually he built a family. War and Peace and Anna Karenina cemented his status as a literary giant, drawing comparisons to figures like Shakespeare or, in modern times, perhaps Cormac McCarthy for the scope and depth of his work. Yet even as the accolades piled up, he felt a spiritual void intensifying. In his essay A Confession, Tolstoy described the overwhelming sense of purposelessness that engulfed him in his later years. The why questions would not let him be, and they took on a specific urgency after the age of 50. He recognized that all he had built, his fame, his wealth, his family, would be snatched away by death eventually. This sense of finality led him to wonder whether anything truly mattered. In many ways, Tolstoy's life echoes a common pattern. Human beings, especially those who enjoy relative security or success, can coast for a long time without confronting existential anxiety. Yet the question of mortality is always looming in the background. All it takes is one trigger, an event, a certain age milestone, the death of someone close, or even a sudden introspective moment to awaken this anxiety. For Tolstoy, the onslaught was merciless. He could not rationalize a way out of his existential dread through reason, because every answer he produced felt incomplete. He suspected there was something fundamentally wrong with his soul, and his own fictional works reflect that. One of his most notable characters, Levin from Anna Karenina, grapples with very similar anxieties about life and death, about why we exist at all if we must eventually cease to be. Tolstoy's existential dread is immortalized in that character's repeated loops of questioning. If not today, then tomorrow. If not tomorrow, then 30 years from now. Does it really matter whether it's one day or one decade? We all must face our end at some point, and so the question that tormented him was why anything at all should matter in the interim. As a result of these tormenting thoughts, Tolstoy found himself drifting towards suicidal ideation. He considered that perhaps ending one's life was the only logical move in a meaningless universe. But rather than taking that step, he chose to embark on a different kind of journey, a quest for meaning. He dug into philosophy, science, religion, and multiple spiritual and ideological frameworks to see if any could provide a satisfying answer to the big why that loomed over him. One of the metaphors that deeply affected him was a parable he recounts in a confession, concerning a man who is chased by a wild beast and ends up dangling in a well above a dragon's jaws while trying to lick a few drops of honey from a branch. Tolstoy identified strongly with this image. For him, the beast was the existential dread. This sense that life was relentlessly hunting him, and the dragon was death, waiting at the bottom no matter where he turned. The honey, sweet but fleeting, represented life's transient pleasures that distract us momentarily but do nothing to change our ultimate fate. This parable resonated with Tolstoy's perception of his own life, teetering between the terror of unstoppable existential dread above him and the inevitability of death below, with brief diversions offered by the sweet illusions of worldly enjoyments. The question became, was there anything that could truly offer him peace or real meaning? Philosopher after philosopher seemed to disappoint him. He read Solomon, Socrates, and even studied the teachings of the Buddha. While he found parts of them compelling, no single philosophy fully quelled his despair. Solomon's laments of vanities mirrored Tolstoy's sentiments that everything was essentially meaningless. Socrates offered insights into the examined life, but that alone did not quite settle the unrest in Tolstoy's soul. Buddha's teachings about suffering and detachment intrigued him, but he still felt that something was missing. He also turned to science, hoping that it might shed light on the nature of existence. Yet instead of offering consolation, scientific theories like Darwinism only seemed to confirm a nihilistic worldview. Humans as mere accidental products of evolutionary processes, lumps of energy that emerge, survive for a spell, and then vanish. Biology told him that cells age and die. We are here for a blink in cosmic time, and then we're gone, leaving no grand design behind. He found no impetus in such a narrative for how to cope with the longing for a lasting purpose. If anything, science seemed to reinforce that there was no overarching reason for life, leading him back into the grips of despair. From these studies, Tolstoy concluded that people tended to respond to the absurdity of life in roughly 4 ways. First, some people simply ignore the question entirely, continuing with their daily routines as though nothing is amiss. Tolstoy saw this as a form of obliviousness or even willful ignorance. One attempts to avoid the existential question altogether. In some respects, this aligns with Albert Camus' concept of absurdism, in which one might acknowledge that the world is irrational or meaningless but simply decide to go on living anyway, meeting friends for coffee, cherishing small pleasures, and pushing away the darker thoughts. However, Tolstoy felt that ignoring the question entirely was not sustainable for a person of intellectual curiosity. Once the why seeds are planted, ignoring them completely becomes nearly impossible, especially after personal tragedy or the realization of one's mortality knocks you out of complacency. The second response Tolstoy observed was a kind of Epicureanism, where people focus on pleasure and indulgence to cope with the awareness of death and meaninglessness. They chase wealth, relationships, entertainment, and personal comforts to distract themselves. While this approach might produce temporary relief or happiness, it fails to tackle the fundamental issue. As soon as the pleasures fade or a new crisis emerges, existential dread returns. The honey from that parable might be sweet, but it won't stop you from eventually falling into the dragon's jaws. For Tolstoy, living only for pleasure seemed hollow, a cycle of momentary highs followed by inevitable lows. The third response was more drastic, ending one's life to escape the burden. Tolstoy observed that some individuals simply do not have the emotional or psychological capacity to endure the strain of existential questions, so they opt for suicide. Indeed, he admitted that he himself had been drawn to this solution more than once. But something in him resisted that path. Even in the grip of despair, he maintained enough hope or curiosity to keep going. He urged in his confessional writings that one should not be swallowed by this notion. Instead, he proposed that people keep an open mind and continue searching. Answers may not come overnight, but to end one's life forecloses the possibility of ever arriving at peace. Then there was a fourth way, which he described as a kind of paralysis, being stuck in a passive state after realizing the seeming futility of everything, yet lacking the will to either distract oneself, fully indulge in pleasures, or end one's life. This was a limbo where people recognized the pointlessness but continued living as though on autopilot, neither searching for answers nor finding a reason to push forward with any conviction. Tolstoy considered this the weakest form of existence, in which one drifts along without resolution or even a sincere attempt to discover one. None of these 4 paths offered Tolstoy real solace. He wanted something that transcended the material world and the finality of death. This brought him to re-examine religion, specifically the faith he had been so skeptical of in his youth. A crucial turning point arose when he began observing the poor peasants who lived and worked around him. He saw that these people, who in many respects endured far greater hardships than he did, possessed an unwavering faith in God. Despite their struggles, they seemed able to find joy, purpose, and resilience in their daily lives. The question gnawed at him. How could such simple, uneducated folk, without the many luxuries available to him, approach life with a steadier spirit than he had? This observation, which might seem straightforward on the surface, shook Tolstoy to his core. Perhaps, he reasoned, it was faith that allowed these peasants to navigate a life of toil and uncertainty. They did not overthink their eventual demise nor obsess about whether life had cosmic meaning. They simply believed in God and in a higher moral order, and that belief seemed to anchor them and provide a sense of belonging and purpose. Tolstoy, who had spent so many years trying to reason his way out of despair, had effectively shut the door to faith on purely rational grounds. Yet now he began to suspect that rational thought alone might not be the key to unlocking life's deepest mysteries. Indeed, he concluded that reason could only take him so far. Observing peasants who embraced faith in the infinite, some intangible force that provided a larger moral framework and a promise of transcendence, made him question his prior dismissal of such belief systems. It wasn't that these people had proven the existence of God to him in a strict logical sense. Rather, their lives were examples of how faith infused them with resilience, direction, and hope. The more he dwelled on this, the more he realized that no scientific explanation of existence could supply him with a reason for being. No philosophical treatise could fully dispel the dread of mortality. But faith, even if it defies strict rational proof, might. Faith came to Tolstoy as something of a revelation, though it was far from an unthinking leap. He wrestled with it, acknowledging that his rational side found the concept of an infinite or transcendent deity unprovable. Still, the alternative, continuing down the spiral of nihilism, was no longer bearable. He recalled that many of the greatest minds in history had also engaged seriously with religious or spiritual perspectives, seeking to comprehend the intangible dimensions of human existence. Tolstoy found that some form of spiritual anchoring was often at the heart of societies, across cultures and eras, providing people with moral codes and a sense of ultimate purpose. The deeper he delved into this possibility, the more convinced he became that embracing faith was not merely about adhering to dogma or traditional rituals. Rather, it was about acknowledging that there might be a dimension to life beyond the purely empirical or material. He realized that holding on to a belief in something larger, call it God, the infinite, or the divine, gave a person the strength to confront mortality without collapsing into despair. Once he began to entertain this framework, Tolstoy found that the existential torment eased. The why questions began to find answers, not through a neat syllogism or formula, but through an acceptance that there is more to existence than one's personal, finite journey from birth to death. Tolstoy's new perspective did not align perfectly with Orthodox Christianity, which he had criticized for much of his life. Instead, he formulated his own interpretations, drawing from various Christian doctrines, but also from his readings of Buddhism and other spiritual teachings. The core theme was that faith bridges the gap between the human mind and the cosmic scale of existence, offering a different kind of knowledge, a knowledge of the heart or soul, rather than the intellect. It was as though he recognized that the intellect alone, left to roam free in the fields of existential inquiry, would eventually run into a dead end. Once Tolstoy embraced this more modest faith, everything began to change in his day-to-day life. He no longer found meaning in hoarding wealth or accumulating accolades. Convinced that humility and service to others were more valuable pursuits, he gave away large portions of his possessions, much to the dismay of some of his family members who preferred the comforts his fortune provided. He also began engaging more deeply with his workers and the local peasants, trying to live closer to the land and to the people he had once observed from a distance. By simplifying his daily routine, dressing more plainly, and devoting himself to acts of kindness, Tolstoy discovered a peace that had eluded him for years. Yet this peace did not mean he abandoned writing or critical thought. He continued to produce philosophical essays, polemics on religion, and reflections on ethics. However, his focus was no longer purely intellectual. He combined the intellectual rigor of his earlier years with the spiritual insights he had gained, forming a worldview that emphasized moral responsibility, compassion, and the importance of living an honest, humble life. No longer would he chase after fleeting pleasures, nor sink into paralyzing nihilism. In his mind, faith provided a vantage point from which life's tragedies and the omnipresence of death became less threatening. They remained realities, but they no longer overshadowed everything. Interestingly, his transformation did not come without conflict. His wife and children struggled with the changes. He had once been an aristocrat who exemplified status, producing world-renowned novels and living in relative luxury. Suddenly, he grew critical of the very pillars of that aristocracy: wealth, social conventions, complacency in the face of suffering. Tensions within his family arose, as they had to adjust to his new convictions. Nonetheless, Tolstoy persisted, believing that he had finally found an authentic way of being in the world, one that gave him the peace he so desperately sought. Levin's character in Anna Karenina offers a literary foreshadowing of this evolution. In the novel, Levin grapples with existential questions, fears about death and meaning, and eventually finds solace in a form of spiritual awakening that resonates with Tolstoy's own journey. War and Peace, too, explores themes of fate, providence, and the interplay between free will and inevitability, although Tolstoy's personal crisis really surfaced after he had finished writing those monumental works. Still, one can see the seeds of these ponderings in his earlier writings. His later works and essays became more direct about spirituality and morality, reflecting a man who had learned from his darkest hours. Tolstoy lived to the age of 82, passing away on November 20th, 1910. By the end, he had made peace with his life and his impending death, grounded in his belief in the infinite. While critics and scholars have long debated the nature of his faith, some calling it Christian anarchism, some describing it as a highly personalized Christianity, others branding it a form of spiritual universalism, it is clear that it gave Tolstoy an internal harmony. He no longer woke up each morning tormented by the why of existence. Instead, he found a sense of purpose, anchored by the conviction that life is not just about what we see and measure, but also about what we can sense beyond the material. That intangible dimension, for him, was God. One of the most illuminating aspects of Tolstoy's journey is how it parallels the arcs of many individuals throughout history who come face to face with the specter of meaninglessness. Nihilism can loom large when one fixates on mortality and the apparent indifference of the universe. Philosophers such as Nietzsche, Camus, and Kierkegaard all wrestled with variations of this question. Nietzsche saw the death of God as a crisis, while Camus emphasized defiance in the face of the absurd, and Kierkegaard championed a leap of faith. Tolstoy ultimately joined the ranks of those who decided that a leap, an acceptance of something beyond rational proof, was the only genuine resolution to the suffocating dread of absolute meaninglessness. It's worth noting that Tolstoy's story can be seen as a lesson in how external success fails to immunize a person against inner turmoil. From the outside looking in, one might think that writing War and Peace, one of the most lauded novels in world literature, would secure an unshakable sense of accomplishment. One might believe that living on a spacious estate, surrounded by admirers and supportive family members, would guarantee emotional stability. But Tolstoy's crisis underscores that existential dread can erupt even when all worldly measures of success are met. It calls into question a cultural narrative that equates wealth or acclaim with genuine happiness. Tolstoy's experience reminds us that existential anxiety is a human concern, not limited to those who struggle financially or who lack certain opportunities. In reading about Tolstoy's journey, we might also observe the role that humility played in his transformation. He had been an intellectual giant, a man of letters whose works shaped Russian and global literature. Yet for all his brilliance, none of his intellectual pursuits alone could deliver him from despair. Recognizing that humbling truth, admitting that raw intellect could not solve the riddle of existence, opened the door for faith. This humility took the form of living simply, engaging personally with the peasants on his estate, and giving away wealth to serve the less fortunate. From a purely rational standpoint, he might have continued amassing riches and writing philosophical treatises until his final day, but that did not fill the existential void. Once he embraced the idea that there are aspects of life beyond the scope of human logic, he found his equilibrium. Moreover, his reflection on the parable of the man clinging to the branch above the dragon speaks to the broader dilemma many of us face. Are we merely clinging to fleeting delights while ignoring the inevitability of our mortality? The parable does not say we should never taste the honey. In fact, it vividly demonstrates that even in peril, the sweetness can distract us from fear. But that alone is not enough. Tolstoy's conclusion was that we need not just momentary diversions, but an overarching sense of meaning that can stand firm against the terror of death. For him, that sense of meaning was inextricably tied to a belief in God and the eternal. Critically, Tolstoy's revelations did not extinguish his intellect or curiosity. Instead, they reoriented them. He began focusing on how one should live in the face of these revelations, which spurred him to write extensively on moral and ethical themes. His later religious tracts and short stories often challenge readers to examine their motives, question unjust social structures, and consider how a life grounded in love and service to others can be a path to fulfillment. Even if you do not share his specific beliefs, there's an undeniable moral weight to his argument that life's meaning is intimately connected to how we treat our fellow human beings and how we acknowledge a dimension beyond self-interest. Tolstoy's alignment with a simpler, service-oriented existence also highlights the dual nature of faith for him. It was both an internal posture, a belief in the infinite, and an external practice, living more humbly and charitably. He seemed convinced that one could not have the former without some tangible expression of it in one's everyday actions. This mirrors a theme found in many spiritual traditions, the idea that genuine faith should manifest in ethical conduct, compassion, and a revaluation of material priorities. The transformation in how he allocated his resources and the tension this caused within his marriage and household illustrate the challenges that arise when a profound spiritual shift collides with established family dynamics and social norms. By the time he died, Tolstoy had thoroughly redefined himself. He was no longer just the aristocratic author. He was a seeker who found contentment in a faith that transcended the bounds of pure rationalism. That shift is arguably one of the most remarkable personal evolutions in literary history, shaping not just his later works, but also his public persona and philosophical legacy. Readers who delve into his post-conversion essays or diaries can find a man wrestling with moral questions about war, poverty, and government. Some of his views would be considered radical even today, such as his advocating for pacifism, communal living, and radical honesty in public life. These stances came from his newfound conviction that a God-centered morality demanded certain ethical imperatives that could not be ignored simply because society was structured differently. In the broader context of world literature, Tolstoy's existential journey resonates with countless individuals who have similarly faced a crisis of meaning. Some come to different conclusions, perhaps adopting an existentialist stance that affirms personal responsibility without invoking God, or embracing another belief system that suits their cultural or personal background. Yet Tolstoy's story remains influential because it shows how a towering mind and influential figure can be brought low by metaphysical despair and then find redemption in a faith that is, paradoxically, more about surrender than about intellectual conquest. His writing offers a unique bridge between the highest echelons of literary artistry and the humblest impulses of the human heart seeking solace. What can we, as modern individuals, learn from Tolstoy's crisis? One lesson is that sometimes the solution to existential unease isn't purely an intellectual one. Trying to reason our way out of the fear of death might, in some cases, intensify that fear, because reason alone offers no guarantee of immortality or cosmic justice. Another lesson is that no matter how successful or secure we feel in the eyes of society, existential angst can strike at any moment. Being prepared for those questions, acknowledging that they may arise, is important. Yet another lesson is that faith, or a worldview that transcends strict empirical boundaries, has historically provided comfort and meaning to countless people, including those who, like Tolstoy, initially dismissed it. Of course, one might ask, was Tolstoy's faith nothing more than a convenient psychological crutch? Could he simply have sought illusions to escape facing the stark truth of mortality? Critics have raised those questions. Tolstoy himself wondered at times whether he was simply deluding himself for the sake of peace of mind. Yet he came to see his belief as more than a mere coping strategy. He believed it revealed a deeper truth about existence, one that rational analysis could hint at but not fully articulate. He posited that the universal longing for meaning points to an intrinsic dimension of reality. Whether one agrees or not, it's clear that this perspective profoundly changed his life for the better, eliminating the suicidal despair that once consumed him. Tolstoy's reflections also illuminate how the faith of everyday people, not just theologians or philosophers, can shed light on the existential puzzle. The simple devotion he observed among poor peasants was a kind of living testimony to what faith can do for the human spirit. Their acceptance of hardship and their unbroken sense of gratitude in spite of adversity hinted at an insight that highbrow intellectualism could not supply. This, in turn, might remind us that sometimes the raw experiences of ordinary individuals hold keys to questions that lofty academic debates keep circling around. Part of Tolstoy's later mission was to give voice to that simpler faith and to champion the moral clarity he saw in the peasants, opposing it to the hollow sophistication of privileged elites. If you've ever felt stuck in your own loop of why questions, why bother if we're all going to die? Why does anything matter if nothing is permanent? Why do our goals seem insignificant in the face of cosmic reality? Tolstoy's story might be a signpost. It doesn't mean you have to adopt his beliefs wholesale, but it does underscore that there's a path out of nihilism that doesn't require ignoring the problem or succumbing to despair. It might entail engaging with something beyond the reach of logic, be that spirituality, a sense of cosmic order, or even a passionate existential commitment to values like love and goodness. Though each person's path might differ, Tolstoy's testimony suggests that one should remain open to the possibility that life's meaning isn't found in a purely mental puzzle or scientific formula. Additionally, Tolstoy's example of rewriting his life in his 50s is a testament to the idea that it's never too late to change course. Some might assume that once you've established certain patterns, be they indulgence, cynicism, or ambition, it's nearly impossible to shift your worldview. Yet here we see a man halfway through life, in an era without modern mental health support, drastically pivoting from near-suicidal thoughts to a committed life of faith and service. This pivot was not a one-day event. It took time, wrestling, reading, and soul-searching, but it happened. That alone can offer hope to those who feel stuck. It's possible to break out of a long-entrenched mindset and discover a sense of wonder and purpose anew. One might also note the parallels between Tolstoy and his near-contemporary, Fyodor Dostoevsky. Both men experienced crises of faith, wrestled with the existence of suffering and evil, and concluded that faith was the only antidote to despair. Dostoevsky's struggles with gambling, imprisonment, and health issues drove him into reflections on theodicy, sin, and redemption. Tolstoy's existential meltdown was different but arrived at a similar conclusion: that only faith and a sense of the eternal could quell the raging waters of doubt. Their works remain cornerstones of world literature because they tap into these fundamental human experiences of questioning, suffering, and the search for meaning. Meanwhile, Albert Camus, writing decades later, would present an alternative in the myth of Sisyphus, suggesting that one might fight the absurd by embracing life passionately without resorting to illusions. For Camus, the notion that one could live with the knowledge of certain death and no ultimate answers was itself a form of defiance that bestowed dignity. Interestingly, while Tolstoy might have recognized the resilience in Camus' stance, he would likely have argued that it doesn't suffice in the face of a fully awakened consciousness of mortality. For him, only a belief in something truly transcendent could provide a stable foundation for everyday existence. That doesn't negate Camus' viewpoint, but illustrates the variety of responses that intelligent minds have given to the same existential riddle. Within that variety lies each person's unique journey. Tolstoy's life stands as a shining example that the quest for meaning can lead one through many stages: skepticism, disillusionment, curiosity, despair, and finally some form of resolution. If one remains committed to the search, his resolution was rooted in faith, yet the overarching motif is universal: never abandon the search. If you ask these questions seriously, you may not find all the answers immediately or in a tidy package, but the process can itself be transformative. As for how he ended his days, Tolstoy ultimately left his estate in a somewhat dramatic fashion, intending to live out his last stretch of life in harmony with the values he espoused. The tension with his family remained, as they struggled to reconcile their aristocratic upbringing and material concerns with his ascetic leanings. He died at a remote railway station, which symbolizes, for some, the difficulty of sustaining a radical spiritual stance within the framework of conventional society. Yet those who study his biography often see a certain poetic justice in his final days. He departed from the opulent world that had once sheltered him, aligning his final chapter with the humility and searching spirit he had championed after his conversion. If we distill Tolstoy's life lesson, it might be that existential crises are not necessarily catastrophes, but invitations to delve deeper into life's mystery. Where some see only a pit of despair, Tolstoy eventually found a gateway to a more meaningful existence. The darkest questions about mortality, nihilism, and despair became the catalyst for a transformation that allowed him to lead the rest of his years in relative spiritual peace. He realized that the ephemeral joys of life, that sweet honey from the parable, need not be the only focus. One can also find a broader truth that endures when worldly pleasures dissolve. This understanding may resonate especially with those who feel they have everything yet are haunted by a sense of emptiness. Tolstoy's crisis shows that feeling empty in the midst of abundance is not an anomaly. It may be a sign that something deeper calls for your attention. It isn't about rejecting pleasure or condemning success. It's about recognizing that, by itself, these things might not answer life's most pressing questions. There is room in human existence for both gratitude and yearning, both contentment and spiritual seeking. Balancing that tension can be a lifelong endeavor, and Tolstoy's reflections offer a cautionary yet hopeful tale. Even when you believe all is lost, you might discover a path forward that you never saw before. Perhaps that's one reason why Tolstoy's works remain so cherished. In War and Peace, we see a tapestry of lives woven together by war, love, family ties, and philosophical meditations on fate and chance. In Anna Karenina, we see the intense personal struggles, the heartbreaks, and the existential yearnings of characters like Levin. His shorter fiction and essays, especially in his later years, focus more intently on morality, faith, and the meaning of life. Collectively, these writings reveal an author who did not shy away from big questions. Even his own meltdown, his personal crisis, became a subject for public discourse in works like A Confession, bridging the gap between author and reader, inviting everyone to consider their own stance on life's biggest riddles. If you've made it this far, you might be reflecting on your own life. Are you ignoring the bigger questions because you feel they're too vast? Or are you clinging to fleeting pleasures hoping they keep dread at bay? Are you stuck in a rut, knowing life can feel pointless, but too weary to explore alternatives? Or are you in the grip of a crisis, tempted to despair or to question whether existence is worth the trouble? Tolstoy's journey might encourage you to keep an open mind toward possibilities you haven't considered. Faith, in one form or another, was his gateway, but you might find other spiritual or philosophical frameworks that speak to you. Or perhaps you'll adopt a variation of Tolstoy's stance and craft a personalized faith of your own, one that acknowledges the limits of reason yet remains anchored in compassion, humility, and a belief in something greater than yourself. We are reminded, too, that Tolstoy found genuine solace not just in abstract belief, but in concrete service to others. This dimension of his spiritual awakening is especially poignant. A mere intellectual or philosophical acceptance of a deity might not have eased his burdens, but reorienting his life toward the poor, seeking to uplift those less fortunate, and reducing his own material excesses gave him an active way to embody his beliefs. Some faith traditions describe this as faith in action. By living out his convictions through charity, compassion, and simplicity, Tolstoy reaffirmed and reinvigorated the faith that had rescued him from nihilism. That synergy between belief and action is arguably the most powerful takeaway. It's one thing to hold certain ideas in the mind and quite another to weave them into the fabric of everyday life. In the grand scheme, Tolstoy's story remains as relevant today as it was in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Modernity confronts us with many of the same existential questions, and with technology, global crises, and cultural shifts, one might argue that it's easier than ever to feel adrift. We have more information, but not necessarily more wisdom. We have scientific and technological marvels, but still wrestle with moral and existential issues that remain unsolved. Tolstoy's solution, rooting himself in a faith that transcended rational limits and focusing on humble service, might not be a universal prescription for all, but it exemplifies one of the enduring ways people can reclaim a sense of meaning. In that sense, Tolstoy's crisis and subsequent transformation are timeless. They remind us that searching for truth and peace is a defining feature of being human, one that transcends the boundaries of era, nationality, or personal background. It is also noteworthy that Tolstoy emphasized never to give up in the midst of existential dread. He recognized how close he had come to giving in to despair, and he recounted that experience as a warning to others. Never make a permanent decision, such as ending your life, in a moment of such darkness. The possibility for renewal or revelation is always there, just beyond your current horizon. If you ever encounter someone going through a similar crisis, Tolstoy's example can serve as a beacon, underscoring that there is a way forward. It might involve rethinking your foundational assumptions, or opening yourself to a dimension of human experience you previously dismissed. It might involve the humbling recognition that our intellect, while a wonderful tool, can't solve every cosmic riddle. When thinking about your own path, you may even find an inspiring parallel in the way Tolstoy used storytelling and literature as a vessel for these profound ideas. If you're creatively inclined, you might explore your doubts and hopes through art, music, or writing. Engaging with these existential concerns imaginatively can offer fresh perspectives that purely analytical thought might miss. One of the reasons Tolstoy's novels endure is that they don't simply lecture. They dramatize the complexities of human life, letting us vicariously experience the struggles and triumphs of his characters. This narrative approach often resonates more deeply than theoretical treatises. Hence, Anna Karenina and War and Peace continue to speak to new generations, bridging centuries and cultures. By the time we reach the final years of Tolstoy's life, we see a man who has, in a sense, come full circle, starting as a skeptical youth, reveling in worldly pursuits, then descending into existential torment, and finally emerging with a renewed spirit. He wasn't perfect, and he acknowledged his own failings candidly. Yet he found a sort of wholeness, a redemption that let him live out his last decades with less fear and more commitment to values he held dear. He discovered a sense of spiritual security, so that even death itself lost its paralyzing grip. His passing at age 82, amid tension and unpredictability, only unearths the authenticity of his convictions. He was, after all, not living for societal approval, but for the beliefs that had saved him from despair. Each of us can take from Tolstoy's journey whatever resonates. For some, it may be an invitation to explore or re-explore religious faith. For others, it may highlight the importance of humility and service as antidotes to existential ennui. Still others may find in his story a testament to the idea that existential anguish, if faced honestly, can become the crucible of transformation. And perhaps most importantly, we can glean the reminder that asking why does not have to be destructive. On the contrary, it can be the starting point of a deeper, more authentic engagement with life, leading us to live with a heightened sense of purpose, compassion, and connection. Let Tolstoy's Odyssey encourage a genuine search for what truly matters. Whether you approach it through formal religion, personal spirituality, artistic expression, philosophical inquiry, or some combination of these paths, you can keep alive the spirit of questioning that Tolstoy exemplified. You may also learn from his willingness to adapt, to try new approaches when old ones fail, and to remain open to the possibility that reality might be more layered and meaningful than a purely materialistic worldview allows. Far from being a sign of weakness, acknowledging that we need something bigger than ourselves can be an act of profound courage, because it allows us to relinquish absolute control and step into a more expansive vision of existence. If you found Tolstoy's journey instructive, you might want to explore his shorter works where he grapples more directly with moral and religious themes. Stories like Father Sergius, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, or the nonfiction piece The Kingdom of God is Within You. These texts further unpack his spiritual evolution and underscore his conviction that love, compassion, and faith stand at the heart of a purposeful life. You might also find it enlightening to read a confession in its entirety, where he methodically outlines the desperation he felt and how he navigated through it. Engaging with his personal writings can offer a window into the intensity of his existential meltdown and the depth of his subsequent transformation. Yet, even if you never read another word of Tolstoy's works, simply reflecting on his trajectory can spark insights. Here was a man who had it all, yet came face to face with a chasm of nihilism. His ultimate discovery was that the rational mind alone could not fill that chasm, but faith, and the humility and service it inspired, could. Whether you agree or disagree, it remains a powerful statement about the human condition and the varied routes we can take when confronted with our own mortality. Perhaps Tolstoy's lasting gift to us is the invitation to keep searching and never settle for a shallow or despairing view of life, no matter how disillusioned we may become. If you're wrestling with big existential queries or feeling weighed down by the apparent meaninglessness of it all, take a cue from Tolstoy. Do not give up. Life might seem insurmountably bleak in one season, but a shift in perspective, be it spiritual, moral, or philosophical, could open horizons you never imagined. The search itself can be arduous, but it can also be richly rewarding. However you define your version of faith or meaning, the process of seeking it wholeheartedly can alleviate the anguish of existential dread. Tolstoy's story stands as living proof that despair can be transformed into a more grounded sense of purpose. It's also worth noting that we live in a time when mental health support and community resources are far more accessible than in Tolstoy's era. If you find yourself slipping towards suicidal thoughts or a debilitating crisis of meaning, help is out there. Through counseling, support groups, spiritual communities, and sometimes even medication for those who need a temporary stabilizer. Tolstoy's example doesn't mean you have to go it alone. On the contrary, it can be interpreted as an encouragement to find community and shared faith, just as he found a model in the faith of the peasants around him. An important part of his revelation came from observing and connecting with others whose simple belief carried them through life's trials. Ultimately, Tolstoy's journey is one man's path, but it resonates because it touches on universal themes: mortality, purpose, existential dread, hope, and the quest for spiritual insight. It reminds us that while we are finite, we can orient ourselves toward the infinite. While we suffer, we can also find redemption and a sense of transcendent love. While we may be alone in our consciousness, we can come together in communities of shared belief and moral commitment. And while death awaits us all, our attitude toward life can imbue our remaining years or decades with significance that outlasts the decay of our physical bodies. Thank you for joining this exploration of Tolstoy's existential struggle and the resolution he reached. If this discussion resonates with you, feel free to share your own experiences or reflections in the comments. Have you ever felt yourself sliding toward nihilism? Have you found comfort in faith, philosophy, or the simple joys of daily life? Do you agree with Tolstoy that reason alone cannot solve the riddle of existence? Or do you believe there might be a purely rational path to peace? Your thoughts might spark a dialogue that could help others on their own quests. And if you found this conversation valuable, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel so you won't miss future content that dives into the philosophical and spiritual dimensions of our human experience. We wish you the best on your own journey of meaning and discovery. And with that, see you in the next video.